Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr, and I'm the manager of the Academic Programs and Outreach at JDC Archives. I'm pleased to welcome you to the JDC Archives first webinar. We are delighted with the response we have received, and we have with us today audience members from throughout the United States, as well as Europe and Israel. Today's webinar is organized in the context of the Sorrell and Lauren Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established in 2015 with a generous gift from Dr. Sorrell and Lauren Chessin. Our speaker today, Emily Bengels, is the recipient of the Sorrell and Lauren Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship for 2019. Emily graduated from Bryn Mawr with a major in Romance languages and then received a master's degrees from Rutgers Graduate School of Education in language education and from the University of Missouri, Columbia in gifted education. A teacher with over 20 years experience, she has participated in Holocaust education programs and seminars globally. All of these experiences guided Emily to pursue a doctorate in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College. She's currently working on her dissertation on the topic she will share with us today: Interagency efforts for child rescue and immigration to the United States, 1939-1942. Our format is that the speaker will present for 45 minutes, and this will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are turned off, and we will take questions via the Q&A function on the Zoom. Thank you. Emily?
Thank you so much. France in the 1920s and 1930s, this was the place to be. Artists, writers, philosophers, and scholars were drawn to Paris for its open culture and for the freedom of expression it represented. For Eastern European Jews who saw the anti-Semitic writing on the proverbial wall, France was a beacon of hope and a safe haven to ride out the tide of hatred that Nazism had stoked. In the decade before World War II, over 150,000 Jewish immigrants had escaped to France and made it their home. Many of them became French citizens, and many of the children even went through the French public school system. There was no expectation for France to fall to the Nazis. On the eve of the war, the 300,000 plus Jewish people in France believed they were in a safe place. By 1942, however, this was distinctly not the case. The Val d'Ivre roundup of Jews in German-controlled Paris was followed by months of deportations to the extermination camps in Eastern Europe. Individuals in the unoccupied Vichy France were susceptible to these deportations as well. 2 years of legally enforced discrimination against Jews in all parts of France had led to a point where even the United States, with its strict refugee policies, began to bend. My research looks into the attempts from US-linked organizations to help children escape France during the Vichy years. There was a point when the newspapers of the US cheered on that the Jewish refugee children are coming, and there was a possibility of 5,000 of them being allowed out of France. What went wrong? Could it have been avoided? In particular, I focus on the efforts to help children living in collective homes throughout southern France. These homes, under auspices of various agencies, among them the Quakers, the Swiss Red Cross, the YMCA, the OSE, a French Jewish children's aid group, sheltered thousands of children from infancy through age 17. The children who survived often spoke with great love for the care they were given in these maisons. The adults who ran and organized and advocated these children's colonies gave their heart and soul, and sometimes their lives, to act in loco parentis and to protect the children in every way possible. The promised 5,000 children never made it out of France. Even the original 1,000 visas for children to come to America were not used before the French borders closed. About 340 children from these homes made it to the United States before the westward escape route was closed. What went wrong? What can we learn from that failed opportunity? First, it's important to know about what I mean by children's homes. I intentionally use this phrase, children's homes, because later on the terminology took on political and cultural weight. You see, in Europe during the interwar period, it was not uncommon for children whose parents could not care for them to be sent to orphanages. These children were not orphans like our image of Orphan Annie in the United States of the same era. These children sometimes were even able to visit their families on weekends. However, in the 1920s and 1930s of Europe, it was not uncommon, and it was even acceptable, for institutions to take on the job of taking care of children when parents were not financially or physically able. As the United States was beginning to shift to a model of foster care, European group living situations were still an accepted and valued way of life for those in need. So, when Nazism began to show its ugly face and affect Jewish children in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other places, an effort was made to bring these children to safety in France, England, and wherever it was possible to give them shelter and care. In general, in the United States, when we speak of Kindertransports, we are referring to the rescue of children to England, but it is not only England that took in Jewish children in need. I'm focusing on the French Kindertransport, which later became, in part, an American Kindertransport. So where were these children housed? With such an influx of children, there was a need to house them and care for them. The challenge was to find places large enough to take in such vast numbers. At the same time period, the cost of taking care of old mansions had become prohibitive for families of old wealth. And in fact, many such families, that of Baron Ginsburg, some of the Rothschilds, had already fled to the United States. This left old chateaux, technically castles, but at the very least mansions, available for lodging large groups of children. Early on, in fact, it was the Baroness de Ginsburg who suggested using her homes for German Jewish refugee children. On the left here, you see Villa Helvetia, located in Montmorency, France, about 10 miles north of Paris. This chateau was in use until the invasion of France, and then the children rushed to another house or other houses in unoccupied France. I will be speaking a lot about its director, Ernst Papanag, as this webinar continues. On the right-hand side, you will see an illustration drawn by one of the children of Château de la Ile in Ariège, France, nestled in the Pyrenees. We also know a lot about this home because after the route to the US was closed, some of the children from La Ile were able to make it safely to Switzerland. While I was looking through the JDC archives, I came upon the memorandum that you'll see in a moment, which speaks to the JDC's role in the French Kindertransport. You'll note that it was dated December 19th, 1938, just a little over a month after Kristallnacht. The number of children who could be helped was not specified, just, quote, a considerable number of Jewish children from Germany and Austria. The link to the OSE in organizing the efforts is clear here, as is the vast sum of money needed to help the children with such short notice. A sum of over 1 million francs. That's how the missive ended up in the JDC archives. 1 million is a big number, but I couldn't tell exactly what 1 million francs meant. What was the buying value of 1 million francs in France at the end of 1938? Especially with the quick devaluation of money at that point. I didn't want to make any assumptions. Luckily, the New York Times archives provides weekly exchange rate information, and I was able to see that at the time, 1 million francs was over $380,000. Adjust that for inflation. I used the Consumer Price Index, and you'll see that the initial funds committed to this project were the equivalent of about 6.75 million US dollars. There are many ways to calculate inflation, all with significantly different results, but no matter how you view it, a large financial commitment was made very early on to help these children. We did not know then what was ahead, but we knew help was needed, both in terms of finance and organization. The JDC and the OZE rose to the occasion. So the children came. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Archives has photos of boys and girls on their trek from Germany to Belgium to France, the presumed land of the free. I could not share it for this webinar, but if you go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Archives online and search for German Jewish refugee boys arrive at Quincy-sur-Seine, you'll be able to watch precious footage of boys arriving at a home just south of Paris on July 4th, 1939. It shows them getting off a bus with baggage in hand, and it really gives life to the moment in which children's lives were shifting to hope in a time of despair. There are also several videos that still exist of the first groups of girls living in early homes in Paris. Before long, France was invaded. Children who were believed to be safe in the environs of Paris were no longer so. Directors of the homes clamored to find new homes, just as the roads out of Paris became near parking lots. Everyone who could was trying to escape. It was only a short while before France was partitioned into the north, the occupied zone, and the south. On this map, it says Zone Libre, but I will call it Vichy France. You'll see on the map on my left many black dots. These represent the locations of children's homes. Ernst Papanag, who was the director of Villa Helvetia and Montmorency that I just showed you, he brought his children to the area of Limoges, where he helped start and maintain several homes. Other homes, which were scattered by the Pyrenees, came about a little later as efforts were made to free children from internment camps. I will address this on the next slide. What's important is that the children who were rescued and successfully ended up in the United States generally came from the homes in the Limoges area and the homes near these internment camps. I do want to point out, though, that there was a second wave of southward escape for children from the occupied zone to Vichy France. This wave came much later, and for most children, came too late for them to benefit from rescue efforts to the US. In 1942, after the Vel d'Hiv roundups in Paris, and as deportations to death camps in the east were beginning from the internment camps in the south, an effort was made to help more children escape the so-called, quote, danger zone. At this time, the JDC sent $25,000 to evacuate and care for children who were stuck in the north of France, just in the time frame of the end of the year. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $400,000. Likewise, after the war, many of these homes that I'm describing reopened to help children readjust to free life. However, that is out of the scope of this research. So children came to the homes through a Kindertransport out of Nazi Europe, through moving from one home to another, and also, perhaps most interestingly, and most pertinent in today's world, through governmentally sanctioned release from internment camps. There were many of these camps in southern France, and they had been open for refugees from the Spanish Civil War long before the French Statut des Juifs came about. These were oppressive French laws of 1940, which denaturalized the newest Jewish citizens of France and sent many of them to life in the barracks of internment camps, where food was scarce, conditions were cramped, and conditions were also very muddy, and typhoid ran rampant. Lice, too. They also ended up separating the French Jewish community between long-term French society members and immigrants or outsiders, that good old divide and conquer tactic. A committee was formed of leaders from many faiths and humanitarian organizations. It is known as the Camps Committee, or the Comité de Nîmes, because it is in Nîmes that most meetings were held. The leader of the committee was Donald Lowry, whose memoir, The Hunted Children, goes into great detail about the group's endeavors. The organization was exceptional. Religious groups that had rarely worked together in the past now met monthly, and with subgroups that met more often, to delegate jobs and create projects for helping alleviate despair in the camps. They garnered the favor of the leaders of internment camps, the directors, and they also garnered favor of the government. They got permission to send doctors and social workers into the camps voluntarily, where they could open up kindergartens, dental clinics, orchestras, and they eventually acquired permission to bring children out of the camps to live in the homes. Though the leaders of the Comité de Nîmes were of all different faiths, representatives of the Quakers, the Catholics, the Unitarians, the YMCA, Jewish organizations, just to name a few, they were consistent in wanting to help everyone in the camps, whether Spanish war refugee or political prisoner or Jewish captive. They were even able to bring food and clothes and chocolate into the camps at a time when the famine was the norm throughout Europe. And though they could not close the camps, the general feeling of the time was that children did not need to be interned, and they were not to be blamed. If their parents were willing to be separated from the children, which is a big if, liberation was possible. In an AFSC Quaker scrapbook, we have this photo. The child liberated from the camp, and then its follow-up. Wakes up the next day in an Ose home. There were many organizations involved with the Comité de Nîmes and later child rescue, but I need to point out some key ones at this time. The JDC was a large funder and advocate and kept connected with just about everyone. They had people on the ground all over the world, and they had access to communication through the transatlantic cable and other things. The YMCA was linked to a house for Czech refugees, and Donald Lowry of the YMCA, as I said, was the head of the Nîmes committee. He had a lot of power advocating with camp directors and sometimes with the government. The shield here represents Cardinal Gerlier, the highest up of several Catholic leaders, who were slower in offering their assistance, but who were crucial in communicating with the Vichy government. The Unitarian Service Committee was the first group to take unaccompanied children to freedom in the US, but did not have the connections with the US governmental agency that led later rescue missions, because Eleanor Roosevelt, its leader, had long-lasting ties with Clarence Pickett of the Quakers. So eventually, the AFSC took charge of selecting and transporting children. They also had homes for children and were involved with providing materials for the care of people. These organizations and the Ose and the International Red Cross had men or women on the ground in the camps, and they provided all sorts of material needs. But they also provided, as I said, kindergartens, medical care, dental clinics, and more. Later on, they helped a lot with rescue to Switzerland. In the early stages of my research, I knew I wanted to explore humanitarian rescue efforts, but there were so many possibilities that interested me. It was a time of great horror, but also a time of great kindness. When I heard about Ernst Papanag, I knew I had found my man. Ernst Papanag was an avid socialist who was high up in the education department of Vienna and was also an Adlerian psychologist. Ernst was a forward thinker who believed in the equality of humans. He believed everyone should be on a first name basis. His family fled Vienna and had the paperwork in place to go to the United States when he was courted by the Ose to leave the Villa Helvetia in Montmorency that I showed you before. Sometimes I think about that pivotal moment. I imagine him coming home and talking to his wife. They had a balanced relationship that was way ahead of their time. She was a doctor. They could have just made it to freedom in the United States. Instead, they stayed, and their lives forever became entangled in the lives of children they saved, and in the regret for the lives they could not save. The first photo here is of the children on a field trip in Paris. Papanag directed homes in the Paris area, and then brought the children south to the Limoges area. Wherever he brought the children, he tried to make education happen. One part of his story that strikes me is about what they call the Cubanos, the Cubans. Remember, though Papanag was a director of homes, his first love was teaching. As news of the ill-fated USS St. Louis reached him, he shared the story with the children in his homes. It became a geography project, a human rights project, and a politics project for the children. But more than that, it became a community project. When the St. Louis ended up back in Europe, the children of Papanag's homes begged Ernst, as they called him, to invite anyone from the ship who needed to come join their home. Sure enough, some of them came. This photo is of the welcome committee for the Cubanos, the Cubans, as the Ose home children named their friends who never made it to land in Cuba. Not just Ernst, but all the leaders of these children's homes took their jobs seriously and passionately. Many were doctors, social workers, and teachers. All were devoted to the humanity of each child and the hopes to provide each child a safe and happy present, as well as a secure future. Testimony to this comes from an interview I had with Papanag's older son, Gus. I asked him for memories about the children's homes in Montmorency near Paris and Montantin near Limoges, and his memories were few. He said it wasn't because he was traumatized then, but rather because he was a teenager, thinking about teenage things. After all, he met the love of his life in the home in southern France. So what happened in these homes? Children were part of a larger community. They were given tools to grow physically, as you can see here with potty training, through each stage of their life, and academically too. Of course, not all reading happened on the potty, as with these little boys. Children of school age walked to and participated in nearby schools. Children took part in the work of the larger community too. If that meant gardening or farming, doing woodwork or cooking, the youth were a part of it all. This was particularly important for two reasons. First, the children were proud of their work and felt a positive sense of responsibility and self-efficacy. Secondly, and more poignantly given the time period, is that children were expected to grow up to become active members of society. There were workshops, ateliers, to teach these children skills, and children even had substantial choice in which workshops for future careers they would become part of. Children in the homes were also able to follow their bliss with hobbies. Here, you see a photo of a band in one of the Ose homes, and here you see children playing sports outside. These photos are from the AFSC Quaker archives, but there are many other amazing photographs of children from this era available through the JDC, the US HMM, and EVO archives. One other important point about the homes is that children took part in the democratic process within the homes. This is at a time when democracy was not happening in the world surrounding the homes. Children had their own student leaders for each room, and older children took care of younger children. There was a court system led by kids and supported by adults. This was all underscoring the value of each individual and the hope that democracy would someday return to Europe and the world. Though the homes were relatively safe havens for children, it became clear that Europe was not safe. The Nazis were advancing. Even in unoccupied France, anti-Semitism was becoming more and more a way of life. There were great deeds from leaders like the Camps Committee, and there were great deeds by people who helped hide children and families. But there were plenty of people who either held their own prejudices, which could now be unleashed, and leaders who wanted to incur the favor of the Germans. A line that struck me in the beginning of my research was spoken by an Austrian father to his daughter, Thea Landauer. He sent her to the United States in 1934, long before even Anschluss. When asked why he didn't send her closer to England or Scandinavia, he said, "There must be an ocean between us." Unfortunately, most people did not see as far ahead as Thea's father, Samuel Kahn. After the French armistice, legal routes of escape were few and far between. England and France were at war with one another. An escape route had to rely on neutral territory. Spain's infrastructure was weak, to say the most, after years of civil war. It was the most common escape route, however. French rescue would usually leave from Marseille, traverse the Pyrenees, go through Spain into Portugal, and then by ship across the Atlantic. In some cases, travel through Spain was avoided, or at least shortened, by an extra ship ride through the Mediterranean, or a brief stay in Casablanca. Such an escape required many moving pieces. Each country required an entrance visa and an exit visa. The rules to acquire such a visa changed on a regular basis, but how they changed was never regular. Though Portugal was generally the last port in Europe for escape from France in this era, the government insisted on transit visas being granted such that one could stay in Portugal only for a matter of days. All the paperwork and funding needed to be complete and ship fare needed to be settled before groups of children left France. Furthermore, there were quotas, and children in any given rescue group did not always possess the same nationality. There was the cost of these visas and the cost of travel, paperwork, coupled with the cost of housing people in between steps of the journey and that paperwork. And of course, there was the need for escorts to help these children, often each for one leg of the journey, and then the paperwork and funding for each subsequent escort. Here's another photo of Ernst Papanag taken at a surprise party for his 39th birthday. You can see the jollity and joy, you can see the energy in the community of children, but also the peace they shared together. Ernst Papanag had to leave the Ose homes rather abruptly. He was given word that as an active socialist and a Jew, he was in danger and that the Vichy police were going to come for him within a day or two. Many children wrote later about his promise to them. He would go to America and bring them to the United States soon thereafter. Some felt betrayed when months passed without hearing from him, but he wanted to keep that promise. At the time, he did not have an exact plan, but he had connections with some of the Rothschilds, connections with the Ose, which had a new American branch, and he knew that Eleanor Roosevelt knew his name for some of his past labor advocacy. He aimed to keep this promise, and the promise followed him for the rest of his life. Ernst, his wife Lena, and his sons Gus and George took the escape route I shared on the previous screen. In the middle of Spain, though, George, the younger son, had a bout with appendicitis. Time was of the essence for escape, and it was never clear in Spain if you were in safe territory or not. But the boy needed medical help. Years later, in an interview you can catch through the Shoah Foundation, George Papanag credited himself, jokingly I think, with enabling much of the future rescue efforts. As happenstance would have it, the doctor who helped him in Spain knew of Papanag and the children's homes and offered to help with some of his connections within Spain. Unfortunately, however, escape from Vichy France in the early 1940s was not as easy as a promise and an advantageous appendix infection. Papanag came to a U.S. that saw him as an outsider, a U.S. that had its own issues with anti-Semitism, and a U.S. whose Ose office was not exactly operating out of a hotel room. Papanag took on a job as a custodian in order to support his family, surprised at how well custodian job was paid in the United States, and then he put forth great effort to arrange for the escape of what he called his children. Later, Papanag wrote a book about his experiences in the children's homes and about his efforts to bring the children to safety. The 1973 Kirkus review of the book stated, "His stories of indifference and infighting among various American charities, including Jewish organizations, are perhaps the most appalling part of the book." In his oral history, George Papanag, the younger son, saved of the appendix problems, claimed his father was reluctant to publish the book because there were, quote, critical things about it, and he, again I quote, hated to hurt anybody. In the introduction to the book, the son says, "I know he wanted this book to be a record and not an indictment." Out of the Fire, as evidenced in the Kirkus Review, and as stated directly by George Papanag, was quite well received initially, even becoming an immediate selection for the Book of the Month Club. The younger Papanag mentions that then, suddenly, all advertisements for it disappeared. There were no reviews for it in the New York Times or even the New York Posts. And he pointed out, then, smugly, even though it was an important book. George Papanag attributes the sudden erasure of this book from the mainstream to discomfort at Ernst Papanag's criticism of the groups that tried to rescue his, quote, his children. In particular, George claims that he, quote, got the feeling there was some interest in not having this book be too well known, because he writes about how many aspects of the American Jewish establishment didn't want these kids over here. Papanag even followed through with the Times, and John Leonard, then editor of the book review section of the New York Times, confirmed that yes, A review had been written, but was never published. The second half of this presentation, therefore, looks at the critique Papanag made, the critique that caused his father's book's publicity to be suppressed. It is now 2020. Archives are available, and I have access to material that he could not see. The JDC and other organizations have been very generous with letting me go through their letters, telephone notes, memoranda, cables, and more. My goal has been, and continues to be, to look at Papanag's well-meaning critique and explore its accuracy. First, though, a little more history about the children who did make it to America and how they did make it here. In the early years of the war, the United States Committee for the Care of European Children was started to help British children come to the United States and evade the danger of bombings to avoid the Blitz. I'll call this group the USCOM. Eleanor Roosevelt had been heralded as a driving force of the committee, and Marshall Field III chaired the committee and did a good job seeking funds and publicity for it. Before long, it was apparent that children on the mainland needed help too. Perhaps, in fact, definitely more urgently. The USCOM did not want to focus just on Jewish children, but rather on all children at need. This is because just beforehand, the Wagner-Rogers Bill, which would have allowed 20,000 German refugee children entry to the United States, had failed due in large measure to anti-Semitism. The U.S. was different from the Wagner-Rogers Bill because it offered temporary visitor visas and because it was created initially for British children. However, after the Blitz, it shifted its focus to bringing refugees from France to the U.S. through the route I described. Papanag was able to connect with the USCOM, who managed the children. The JDC did the lion's share of financing. The AFSC helped choose the children and escort them. And other groups like the Unitarian Swiss Red Cross and the American Red Cross sometimes helped keep these children alive with food, healthcare, and further advocacy. In all cases, the children needed to have parental permission before leaving the camps and before leaving the country. The USCOM was able to bring about 300 children to the US in the next few years. Local papers all over the United States announced the arrivals of these refugee ships and published feel-good stories of the children waving American flags. Papanag came to the US in the autumn of 1940 and began his advocacy stateside shortly thereafter. The machinations for many of these journeys were in place, regardless of Papanag's involvement, but it was he who was able to make the connection with children in the Oze homes that he had left. The ships which left Lisbon started with 3 passages in the summer of 1941 and followed with 2 in 1942. However, in the interim, you'll see that the deportations began and that after the Nyassa crossing, there was the Operation Torch. The United States attacked North Africa and France closed its borders immediately. In all, just over 300 Jewish children were saved, and about 140 of them were Ernst Papanag's kids. So now let's look at the critiques and see how we can evaluate them. Papanag's first critique, and very common critique, was towards Lottie Marcuse, a woman who worked for the German Jewish Children's Aid and was in charge of child placement. Ernst wanted his children to stay together and believed that her insistence on placing children in foster care was delaying the process. His reasons for wanting the children to stay together were based on his European understanding of children's homes and his belief that many parents would survive. Look at some of the words in one of his letters advocating the children. He wanted the children to be acclimatized to America, but not to a new family, because that would require a complete attachment. That would not be possible if the children were still bound to the old family, and he wanted the children to retain this natural tie. It's worth noting that the children who made it to America from Papanag's home also complained about being separated from one another because they saw one another as siblings. After reading through the archives, I will not deny that there was a personality conflict between Papanag and Marcuse. I giggled a lot while I was doing my research in the JDC archives because I found several people having personality conflicts with Lottie Marcuse. It seems that she did a lot of really important work But she also did a fine job at badgering people to give money and provide homes. Many of her letters are along the lines of, so your community can find 2 homes? Great. Can you find 4? Or, so you can give $100? Can you give 200? At one point, there were letters from the head of the JDC asking her to tone it down and hold off sending letters without his reading them. I will also not deny that Papanek's views were not matching America's views about childcare. And even he admitted to asking for help for the children in, quote, institutions. He blamed himself for years afterwards about using that word without knowing its connotations in America. However, Papanek did not have access to the archives, as the JDC was so generous to give me. It turns out that even before Papanek had made it to America, this issue had come up. Here you see in a letter about placing children in a group home in New Orleans in 1938. It speaks of an immigration regulation against placing children in any institution, and that the German Jewish Children's Aid has an agreement with the US government not to place children in institutions, but rather in homes. Note, there were a few cases where individual children were placed in group homes, but they were certainly not all kept together. Just as Papanek faulted himself for the misuse of the word institution, he may have run into other struggles with his own communication. This letter from June 1941 is very telling. It appears that there was a request to publish a report by Papanek about the children, and this letter states why Papanek's report should not become a JDC pamphlet. Its first concern is that the report is almost a year old. I would argue that in a year, the need for the report had only grown stronger. Second, though, is a statement that the report is more a matter of social work than of interest to the JDC clientele. Note, 70 years later, the JDC does care and has helped finance this fellowship in my research. Third, the letter points out that Papanek's English is still not smooth. The translation is awkward, Ms. Adlerstein says, and offers to rewrite it. However, the fourth bit is telling, and that's that the Baroness who helped create some of the homes was still connected to and supporting Papanek's efforts once he was stateside. In short, Papanek was an outsider, albeit a connected outsider, and his message may not have gotten through as urgently as he intended, or with the language for American ears to hear. Another concern that Papanek had, for which he faulted Lottie Marcuse, was that the children were encouraged to forget their past life. He felt cut off from his children, but was even more concerned that the children were cut off from their parents. Letter writing had been a very important part of life in the homes. It was a lifeline for the parents in internment camps, or worse, those who had stayed behind in Germany. Here is a poignant letter to from a mother whose son had just left for America. Write to us often, and do not forget us, she implores. I've read so many letters like this. My heart aches each time. Papanek was onto something, though, when he accused Lottie Marcuse of blocking children from their past life. I'm sure it was not malicious on her point. Her view was that the children needed to forget as much of the past in order to succeed. In fact, there are reports and books about how successful these children were. However, Papanek was not the only one who was unhappy about her shutting off the children from their past. Here's a letter from the US Com to Lottie Marcuse, pointing out that a great many parents do not receive letters from their children and have no news at all. And it goes on to request that she find ways to reassure these worried parents. Besides personality conflict, there are more serious complaints. Papanek's most scathing one, perhaps, was that the American Jewish agencies did not sense the urgency. Well, you know and I know that there was that document right after Kristallnacht sending children from Germany to France. However, Papanek was not alone in this concern. Leanne Willman of the American branch of the OZE wrote a letter to JDC's executive director in August 1942 expressing this very concern. Let's look at some excerpts of J.C. Hyman's response. We share your great anxiety over the fate of the Jewish population in France. We did not wait for the suggestion. He lists connections with the State Department, the Quakers, the President's Advisory Committee, Catholic organizations, and even the American Charge d'Affaires. This all sounds valid, But I had to dig deeper. Is it lip service? Let's see more. Here is a cable from Vichy, France to the Presse Super News in September 1940, just around the time Papanag was making his way to the US. Look at some of the phrases here, and I will translate them out of cable telegram speak as best I can. Many thousands Jewish children in France face death from hunger cold this winter. No minute to be lost. Same fate threatens children's homes. This was before Papanag could exert pressure, but there was already pressure and news reports about the urgency. In 1942, Lowry of the YMCA and the Camps Committee sent a message pressuring for the American permission for the rescuing of these very 5,000 children I introduced in my opening. Here he writes, Vichy adamant about adults, but apparently might exempt children if America accepts. Thus, quick permission, entry US, only hope. Sufficiently speedy action to save 5,000 children under 16. This came after there were a series of big meetings between humanitarian agencies leaders and Laval and Marshal Pétain, resulting in the final agreement to provide these 5,000 visas. Lowry's writing it from Europe doesn't mean that the Americans had urgency, but it is a clear message with only hope written in it. It intrigues me to see other things like the responses from the JDC to offers for help. For example, here, the Baroness de Rothschild wrote asking what she could do. This was at the most urgent time when deportations were in full swing. The JDC executive director wrote back, we are quite certain that if the problem can be worked out practically in terms of the necessary visas and arrangements facilitated in the receiving country, the question of money required will not be the stumbling block. The message of hope and confidence is in stark contrast with what followed. This is a response to the World Federation of Churches' offer to help provide emergency emigration assistance. You'll see the flurry of handwritten commentary. Did you talk to the US Com? Have been in touch with the committee on the Federation of Churches of America. Can you estimate total number involved? At least in this 11th hour, there were big moments of taking rescue seriously. Here's the big thing. I believe publicity was a key problem in the relief efforts. Papanag writes in Out of the Fire about press reports stating, when they came here, they looked like tired, wan, broken little old men and women. None dared to laugh out loud, and few smiled, even the younger of 7 and 8. France had a certain degree of pride. The government did not want to be portrayed as treating children like that. At the same time, Laval and Pétain were anxious about press showing that France was helping Jewish children. This could be bad news for their relationship with the Nazis. When the Vichy government heard about these press reports, the 5,000 exit visas were no longer able to be given at once. To avoid bad publicity, the government would release the visas in groups of 50 once each group of children arrived in the US. Another would be allowed to leave France. Time was of the essence, and publicity mixed with pride slowed the process down. Similarly, reports that were too optimistic stateside could cause a relaxed feeling. One group claiming credit for another's action, even if that action was shared, could cause ill will and delays at a time when there was no wiggle room for delays. Look at this handwriting in the margins. This is an outrageous bit of impudence. They began to realize that publicity was an issue. Once the danger of the press was clear, there was a containment effort. This letter from J.C. Heinemann to someone offering to help with publicity makes that clear. At this stage, it would be unwise and undesirable to break into publicity. He goes on making the important point that US Com should not be focused on working, quote, on behalf of Jews alone, but for all Americans, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews who abhor the events in France. There were still big issues with anti-Semitism in the US. And he insists that no publicity shall be issued until virtually authorized as a result of further discussions with the State Department. But was bad publicity really the issue? Was Laval using the publicity concern as a cover-up for his desire of inaction or negative action? Look at this quote from September 26, 1942. Laval said, "No man and nothing can sway me from my determination to rid France of foreign Jews and send them back where they originated. It hurts me to read that. He goes on, I will take no lessons in humanitarianism from any country. Ernst Papanag created amazing environments for and with his children, and he continued to advocate for all children for the rest of his life. However, he did not have the advantage of the 2020 vision we have looking backwards, or of the access to archives. He didn't have access to the notes from the camps committee like these are. He didn't read all the reports about children from many homes, not just his homes, that Marjorie McClellan of the Quakers needed to help decide which children could come over. He didn't have all the information we have. He also didn't know that there were big conversations in each of the organizations about where to best devote funds and energy to help the people in France. If the war was going to end, wouldn't it be better, they thought, to help thousands of people stay healthy and alive in Europe by helping in the camps than to help hundreds of children leave to the United States? Many organizations chose to help the greater number of people. And then time ran out. The amount of work that needed to be done in the camps, out of the camps, and on the rescue ships was more immense than I can imagine, and probably more immense than Ernst Papanag could see at the time. So there was no crystal ball. They didn't have archives at the time. They didn't even have the internet. Mail was censored. The transatlantic cable was limited. And there was a world war going on. Personalities were involved. People are complicated. Pride is complicated. Passion is complicated. In the end, I can say much was done to rescue the children. Much more could have been done. It was not funding that was the problem. It was not willpower. It was human fallibility that led to hatred and pride, and sometimes undue optimism. However, the 300 or so children that did come over through the efforts I described made America their home, and many of them have written memoirs, given oral histories, or shared their works with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and other local Holocaust memorial places. Their stories include gratitude and joy from their times in the homes, a haven in a time of war. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture, Emily. We now have time for question and answers, about 15 minutes. Please remember that your microphones are turned off, and send us the questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll answer them. So I will start with the first question. I mean, it's just a very general question. How did you get interested in that topic of Papanag?
It's a great question. At first, I was interested in Le Chambon, where they hid children in France during the Holocaust. And then I thought, children got there somehow. So I started learning about how groups work together to get children to Le Chambon. Then I started reading about, there are other places other than Le Chambon. And suddenly I found Papanag, and he reminded me of a teacher I had had in his democracy within the classroom, in his equality. It turns out that it's possible that he had been a teacher at the same school where my mentor had been a student, an education student. And who knows, I now like to think that he has that connection with me, but whatever it is, that idea of free education hit me. And then when I read his book, I really recommend reading Out of the Fire. Even if he didn't have 2020 vision, he makes his world come so alive. I wanted to see more about it. And you gave me the opportunity.
Thank you, Emily. So I see that we have some questions. The first question is, did anything surprise you during your research?
All sorts of things surprised me. I think the biggest one was what I mentioned last. I was so wrapped up with Papanag that I started thinking about him and his children as my children. And I stopped thinking about, there are so many others also. And gosh, there were so many. And that decision of, do we help a few people survive or more people live longer? It's like a Sophie's choice kind of thing. The other thing that surprised me was the need for groups to have paperwork of certain stature. The Quakers were not able to do all their advocacy, for example, because they had a reputation of helping everybody. And in wartime, the United States and England didn't want any extra help to get to the Nazis. So other groups needed to have their stamp, their approval, and do the work that the Quakers might have done, so that it would be clear that help wouldn't be getting into the wrong hands. Yet sometimes it was just a seal that made the difference. In the case of the Unitarians, they made their seal so that they could get the work done that needed to be done to help out.
The next question is, did you see any evidence of JDC or other organization send children to other countries such as Canada, South Africa, or South America? I'm not too sure.
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of efforts, requests to send children just about everywhere. There were files in the JDC sending children to Dominica, they called it. There were children who went by way of Cuba. I don't know if it was the JDC that was involved. You might know more, but there were children who were brought to Canada. There were children who were brought to Scandinavia. JDC worked all over, but in the files that I was going through, there were a lot of efforts to Central America.
Okay, so the next question is a little longer and includes, I would say, comments as well as question. I mean, my name is Lily Meyer, and I'm currently writing a biography of Ernst Papanag, which will be published in January. I was excited to hear about your talk and really appreciate it. And I have to say that you were actually holding back when talking about Papanag's criticism of Marcus. I have two comments. Papanag arrived in the US in September 1940, and by October already had many meetings with US Com, etc. in Washington, DC and New York, as you can see in his calendar. So by the time of the telegram you quoted from November 1940, he was already very involved in this.
Can I interject for a second?
Sure,
That's
sure.
Fascinating. See, when I go to that thing, it's the document says in the records, it's listed as November, but when you read the actual document, it says September. So that's where I ended up getting September from it. It's listed as November on the actual document, not in the filing, but the document has typed on it September, and the word September is written.
Sorry. And secondly, children did not necessarily need parental permission. The OZE forged many of such documents.
Good point. They needed it, technically. I'd love to speak with you at some point, by the way. But there was a lot of forging that was going on during the Holocaust.
And one question, where did you read that Baroness Günzburg gave her own home? In all descriptions I read, she bought a lot of books but didn't give her own.
There was writing from Papanag on that, and I believe it was in writing from Lily Meyer, but I'm not positive, and I can check that and get back to you on that. But she definitely suggested it. In the end, she backed off a little bit, and there were fights about how much she would do, and then she agreed to do more, she agreed to do less. So there are questions about action versus suggestion, but she definitely was involved with it. The Rothschilds definitely were involved with the homes, and they wanted, the OZE was very excited to have that, because they thought, well, if the Rothschilds do this, other people will do it too.
So then thank you, Emily. The next question is, the JDC was also working in the Polish ghettos at the same time. Did you see any internal conflict within JDC over which was more important?
I saw none. However, one thing that I really want to know is, how in the world did Troper get all over the place in a time when it was hard to travel? I keep on reading the documents from him in particular, but also some of the other JDC leaders, written, oh, he's here, he's there, he's there, he's there. And then these beautiful messages of take care of yourself. Your life is more important. We need you to stay around and make all these differences. And so the only time that there became a concern that I noticed, and I've much more research to do, was in terms of helping on, chat just came up and I got distracted, I'm sorry. Making sure that the people who were doing the rescuing could continue to do the rescue. There were 2 questions that just showed up on the chat. Can I just quickly respond to them? Although yes, siblings did not always go together, although there was an effort to help siblings. And when I say the name children's homes, in some cases they were called colony camps, and they were much more than that. But I'm using the word children's homes rather than institutions. That's where it took on the weight when Papanag started to say, oh, they're institutions in the United States. No, we're not creating more institutions. I hope that helped.
So thank you very much, Emily. This was a fascinating, very, very interesting presentation. And thank you for our audience for joining us today. We have 2 webinars coming in June, and invitations will be sent. They will also be announced on Facebook. I also recommend that you visit our website, which includes online exhibits, including one on the aid provided by JDC to children in DP camps in the post-war period. Yeah, stay in touch via our Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you.